I believe as a Christian that everything is filled with meaning, that we God put within us kind of a need for meaning, to make sense of things. We have a yearning for things to make sense. When something seemingly senseless happens, like a child dies or something, we think, why? It's going to be some reason for this. We want to believe that everything has meaning and purpose. And I think art can really maybe express that more than anything else.
Welcome to the Kalos Center podcast. Welcome to another episode of the Kalos Center podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Colleen Warren. Colleen earned her BA in English education at Olivet Nazarene College, her MA and PhD in American Literature at the University of Florida. Colleen has been a professor of American literature at Taylor University in Upland, Indiana for over 30 years. Much of her scholarly work has been devoted to the writings of Flannery O'Connor and Annie Dillard. Her most recent books are Re-Entering Eden, Christian Meditation in Nature, and The First Verb, Cultivating Christian Creativity, which was published by Whitman Stock just last year. I've read both of these books, and they are excellent. Colleen and her husband, Jim, have been married for over 40 years, and they have 4 adult children, all of whom graduated from Taylor. One of Colleen's passions is to do her writing at what she calls her Thoreauvian cabin, which is somewhere in a ravine in central Indiana at an undisclosed location. And in calling her cabin Thoreauvian, Colleen is referencing Henry David Thoreau. So think Walden and nature-inspired creative solitude. When she's not writing or spending time with her kids or grandchildren, Colleen enjoys doing calligraphy, drawing, watercolor painting, lifting weights, hiking, hammocking, and messing around with power tools, she tells me. She also blogs at One Woman Wandering, so you can check out some of her blogging there. So Colleen Warren, welcome to the Kalos Center podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So it's summertime, and somehow I've managed to draw you out of your cabin there, somewhere in the woods, or is it a cornfield? And how close is it to Upland?
It's actually on our property. We have 17 acres, about 5 miles outside of Upland, and so it's 700 steps to be exact from my back door. So it's really convenient for me. But it's hidden from view from anybody else. So even though it's only a half a mile from Interstate 69, and you can hear the white noise of that from my cabin, it feels very secluded.
So what inspired that besides Henry David Thoreau?
I'm finding that I have a greater need for solitude as I get older. Um, and I just like having a place that I can call my own, that people have to knock on the door to get in. So it's just a place that I've tried not to solely with grading or anything like that, but instead just keep for things that I'm doing that are creative and particularly writing. So on my sabbaticals that I've had to work on my writing, I've done them almost exclusively out there, where I've tried to just kind of have a place that I dedicate to that, and so that's what prompted it. I had some money left over from a grant that I got, and Jim said, "Sure, you can use it for that." So we had it built, and so it's been a great addition.
So is it electrified? Do you have lights and electricity out there?
Yeah, only because I have a very long extension cord. So we didn't spend the money to have it, actually, coded for electricity. But I literally have like 3 or 4 extension cords running from our back door to there. So if I can't do lights and coffee at the same time, for example, but I could use one or the other. So it's fun.
That's good. Yep. So your most recent book on cultivating Christian creativity is called The First Verb. That's the main title.
Mm-hmm.
What inspired you to write that?
I had, felt that I had gifts in creativity, not just writing, but other things as well. And I wanted to do it. I felt I had the motivation, but I didn't. I would try to every year, have a resolution. This is the year you're going to be, giving vent to your creativity and allow time for it. And I just never followed through with it. So one year I just got man enough at myself, I guess, to say, doggone it, this is going to be the time I do it. So I made I did everything the opposite of what they tell you to do when you make goals. You're supposed to make very specific goals and, follow through, define them carefully. And I thought, I'm gonna make a really generic one that will allow me a lot of space for cheating, but yet still kind of keep the vow. So I said, do something creative every day, something creative. So that allowed me to, get by with just messing around with Pinterest, getting ideas from Pinterest, collecting things on boards, or reading about it, or hearing about someone else's creativity, or something, anything that would inspire me to be creative. So it wasn't that I required myself to, sit down and do something, produce something. And with that latitude, I was really kinda able to keep that, vow. But there were a couple of things that I, more pressingly wanted to do. So, basically, just wanting that urge to create and not giving vent to it and wanting to follow through with it. And when I finally was able to, then I thought, I want to write about this. I want to share what I did and see if it would work for other people and, do research on creativity. What kind of things help you to be more creative? What kind of things help you stick to, a vow to be creative and that kind of stuff. And also to convince people that they were creative, because especially in talking to students, when you say, how many of you feel that you are creative? I'll probably get, a third of the class maybe will raise their hand, and the others, why not? Well, because I can't draw, or whatever. They think of creativity as just kind of the fine arts kind of thing. And but then when I expand it, and talk about, how many of your creative you think you have a creativity with sports, or creativity with, woodworking, or, building a house or something, then you get more people, "Oh, okay, yeah," they'll see it more broadly. So I wanted to really try to convince people that everybody has that creativity bent.
Good. The main title, the first verb.
Mhm.
What's the significance of that?
I get that from a few people when they're asking about the book, and so my first question is, "Well, what is the first verb of the Bible?" And then you get an idea of how many people know the parts of speech, because the most common answer is "in." So, no,
Huh,
that's a preposition.
that's a
No, that's a
different
good.
book. That's a different book.
Exactly. It's the first verb, so then they'll go there embarrassedly, they'll say, "create." And I said, "Well, that's my point." The first attribute of God that we get in the Bible is his creativity, because we get the story of him creating the world. And so there's gotta be some significance in that. Of course, chronologically, it makes sense, but beyond that, just to focus on God's creativity seems really important. And, because we're made in his image, I think that we are gifted, all of us are gifted with creativity, and it just might be in an area that is a little atypical. You don't think of it as creativity. I use the example in my book of my sister, who I could say is creative with laundry. Some people think that's a stretch, but boy, I mean, she's good at it. She knows how to get stains out. She tinkers around. She messes with things. She looks at things imaginatively, and she's good at laundry.
Mm.
So why not creativity? And so, yeah, that's my point. That because we're made in the image of God, all of us creative, all of us should find what those areas are.
So one natural retort, evidently you've heard, is that, well, okay, in a very generic sense, I'm creative. You know, the way I organize things, the way I can get stains out of clothes or whatever, but I'm not there's no way that I could ever be a fine artist. I don't have any kind of aptitude for that. But in your book, you challenge that. You maintain that everybody has even that, an aptitude for the fine arts. Why do you think so?
It might be wishful thinking, but I really do think you can make some, pretty good case for it. I think the main thing that keeps people from understanding that they have that aptitude is because they haven't even tried. They just
Mhm.
think maybe somebody has discouraged them early on or something when they're a kid. That happens a lot, unfortunately. Oh, you're painting the deer green, it's deer or brown, or something like that, and they just early on been told you're not creative, you're not that type, but you have skills and gifts in other areas. Or another, reason is because they've tried a few things. I've tried to draw, whatever. I'm not good at that, therefore I'm not creative. But they haven't explored enough to find what is their gift. There is something out there. There's a huge range of what, of the arts, ways you can be creative, from writing to drawing to theater to dance to woodworking to building. I mean, there's anything where you're starting with, raw materials and creating something new out of that. That's, we can't do it ex nihilo like God can, but, anything that we can come up with something new and original is art. And I think fine arts, there's so many different areas. I mean, almost inexhaustible that would still
Mhm.
be considered fine arts, weaving, or basket making or whatever, and cloth making, and so just if they search long enough, I think they could find that area that they are gifted in.
So let's step back to a more abstract level. How would you define creativity generally? What is creativity?
I try in the book to kind of come up with some, attributes that, that to me represent creativity. And when most people see that, they say innovation, something that you create that's new, that involves a reassemblage of the raw materials that you have, or something like that, that has something to say, that has some kind of meaning to convey, a unique way of looking at something, a perspective, maybe. A lot of the writers that I like, that's what to me is creative about them. Not that they can put words on a page as much, but the way they make you see something new in a different way. I give the example of J.W. Turner, who I like his later works because he started as a realist painter, but at the end, he becomes really impressionistic, and that's the stuff I like. It's not what really gained him his fame as much, but the way he uses light and helps you see things in a whole different way by looking at the way he paints light is, to me, innovation. That's where he is the most creative, because he's, stepping out from, what he established his reputation on, really, and coming up with something new. So, that's maybe not a full answer for sure. I mean, everybody has a different idea of creativity, but usually those are, when I ask students and stuff, they'll say, yeah, something important to you, or
So even in the sciences, that's necessary. Some would,
yeah.
in fact, emphasize that to a significant degree, including Einstein, who
Hmm.
maintained that the most important quality that the scientist can have is imagination,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
When we think about imagination, usually we think about, the creative arts, not science so much. But when you think of major paradigm shifts, okay,
Yes.
say from geocentrism to heliocentrism,
Yep.
or devising the atomic theory, or Mendel and genetics,
Hmm.
or maybe especially relativity theory and quantum physics. These are imaginative leaps, and it takes a great imagination, takes great um, creativity in order to come up with new scientific paradigms. So maybe keeping that in mind, we can kind of recognize a greater unity to the disciplines than is
Right.
often recognized.
Hmm.
You talk about a theology of creativity.
Yeah.
And in fact, the whole book really is a kind of theology of creativity. What are some of the highlights of what you regard as a biblical theology of creativity?
First of all, that it's based on God's own creativity and the idea of imago Dei, um, where we're made in His image, and therefore we are creative, and we're commanded to give vent to that, to express it. It's not like an option. And I see in the creation story all three parts of the Trinity working together to create. It's obvious God's part, because He's foregrounded. His name is foregrounded in that, God created. So, He's parallel to us as creators, the ones that are making it happen. But when we get the idea in John that Jesus is the Word, then I think Jesus is present in the words that God speaks, to make it happen, which would be maybe comparable to the media that we use in creativity when writing its words still. If in art, it might be paintbrushes or something like that. And then the spirit is there, it says brooding over the waters. And, the most easy connection would be that it's the inspiration, that he is the inspiration, he's the ideas behind it. So all three of them working kind of in cohesiveness, is my model for creativity that undergirds my sense of the theology of creativity.
So let me first, I guess, make an observation, maybe a question about this whole idea of inspiration, okay,
Hmm.
which is a mysterious thing. And you don't have to be um, mm, a Christian or religious or even a theist to believe that this is a real thing, inspiration. But what is it? That is an interesting question. When a person is inspired to write a song or to do something creative, it's a fascinating thing to think about. Where did that line come from? And often, maybe this is usually the case, creative artists will shrug their shoulders and say, I don't know. And
Yeah.
Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, at one fine day in 1965, woke up with this guitar riff, this little melody in his head. And it was in the middle of the night. He just hummed it into his tape recorder, and the next morning listened to it. Yeah, that's good. And he worked out on a guitar. It's a very simple riff, and it became satisfaction. I can't get no satisfaction. That guitar line. Where'd that come from? And so some will, particularly in the Christian subculture, will say, well, God gave me this. Right? It's this is a gift from God. And you know what they mean. If it's a bad song, you might hesitate to say, well, I don't know. Maybe you were moved or inspired in a very kind of general psychological sense, but I don't know if God gave you that song. But I guess my observation here is just to note that if it's a mystery how we come up with ideas, quote unquote, ex nihilo, it's also a mystery with regard to how God comes up with ideas. And maybe that's what we should expect if we're made in the image of God.
Yeah. Then you have a mindset, a certain mindset. And in a Christian worldview, that should be an idea of submission to God, that we do what we do, we create because we want to bring honor to God, because that's a gift given to us by God. And we always keep in mind that we would have none of this if it weren't for God. And so that submissiveness, that humility that comes from saying, this isn't me, this is like, wow, how great I am, or how talented I am, but more what God has given me, and just gratitude for the gift. So that mindset is something pretty important to establish a Christian view of creativity. And then within the system, I have like 3 or 4 different qualities, I think purposes, I guess you'd say, of art that as Christians we should keep in mind. And one of them, the starting one, is bringing order out of chaos. You could say that when I write a book, I have ideas. They're floating all over the place, and I try to put them into order, but with an outline. How does this fit together? What doesn't fit? What I would leave out? And as I write, that gets more and more, solidified and so forth. So every creative act does that. You start with a lot of jumbled ideas and then work towards creating order out of that. And of course, that models exactly what God does when he creates the world. He starts with chaos and void and ends up with perfect order. Another thing that's central to a Christian view of creativity is the idea that to make the invisible visible. That's where meaning comes in, which is connected to the next point, that you're revealing meaning that I believe is intrinsic in the world. God imbues things with meaning. We don't make up meaning. We discover it more. So those are 2 things that work in tandem. Most of the art that I have really loved is something that helps me see something I didn't see before, or in a different way. And so that is what I mean by making the invisible visible. That could be, something about God. It could be something about nature that's revelatory to you. It could be just nothing to do with God per se at all. Just insight or something that you want to express to somebody, but that they cannot see until you show them or talk to them or tell them about that. And so that's connected with meaning, of course, too, because I believe as a Christian that everything is filled with meaning, that God put within us kind of a need for meaning, to make sense of things. We have a yearning for things to make sense. When something seemingly senseless happens, like a child dies or something, we think, why? It's going to be some reason for this. We want to believe that everything has meaning and purpose. And I think art can really maybe express that more than anything else. And going back to the idea of imagination, because God's world, heaven, is not visible to us. The only way we can see it, quote unquote, is through our imagination. So really, you could argue that only through art can you see the spiritual realm. It's what makes it most visible to us through something like that. And then another thing, and this is where people start departing from me. some of my colleagues, for example, would maybe not agree with this. I believe that art, if you're a Christian, should have some kind of moral standard, that you should do things that are only honoring to God. And by that, I don't mean that you don't depict anything sinful or anything dark or that, is a force against God or anything, but the what tone or what vision we have with it is what's important, because the Bible is full, as anybody knows, of horrible sin, and it's sometimes very explicit. Sometimes it's really pretty raw, but always the tone is disapproving. It's not like we're encouraging this. So that's what I mean. A Christian worldview should, if they show sin, should not be approving of it. It should not show like the good side of sin. Always show that this is an aberration. This is not the way we're meant to live. You know, or if something is dark, and depressing, to show that there's a redemptive possibility there. Um, it may not happen. There may not be redemption at the end. Everything doesn't end happily, with everybody getting what they want, but that there's a spark of hope there or
Mm.
something, that shows something beyond it, because that's just as real as the opposite. People say, oh, it's a reality to show that there's dark and, there's depression. Yeah, that's true. That those are true, but it's also true that there's light and hope, you know. So I just want to give kind of equal press, I guess, to that, in when I talk about moral standards. So
Wow.
those
Okay.
are some elements I think are important.
Yeah, that was great. So your comment there about moral standards, I'm with you on that, and I've gotten pushback on that, particularly if you're having a dialogue with someone who's, a secularist or a religious skeptic, and not at all devout in their belief in God or whatever, to suggest that there are these moral standards they need to be abiding by, or that everybody should abide by when they're writing or doing other forms of art. You can really
Yeah,
offend people
yeah,
with that. I mean, they find it offensive. There are three views. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but the three major views on this issue, the relationship between art and ethics. So one has been called aestheticism, and that is that art is immune to moral judgment. And people like John Dewey and Friedrich Nietzsche would say that. It's like art is its own domain, and it's untouched by any concerns regarding ethics. On the other extreme is something that has been called moralism, and that is that ethics, moral qualities are the only value that matters when it comes to art. And Tolstoy, believe it or not, after his conversion later in his life, he became a pretty devout
mm,
moralist, and which is that puts him in the same category at that point with like what we would call
yeah,
fundamentalists, right? I mean, an evangelical fundamentalist is someone who says, like, all that matters is the moral message, right? It seems that you're arguing for, you would promote the view that I would as well. It's a kind of balanced view that no, uh, morality isn't all that matters, but it does matter. And we can apply moral standards to art forms along with other, say, aesthetic
yeah.
standards. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. I mean, your comment that, people who don't believe in God or who don't value that aspect of their lives would not agree with me. Well, I accept that. I know that when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about this as a standard for Christians. So what troubles me is when people who call themselves Christians don't seem to have any moral standards with their art. They do kind of take the first view, maybe that it's immune, that's an area somehow that you don't need to apply morality. I wouldn't use that language myself, but I can have my character use it or something like that, because it's fiction, it's not
Mm.
real. Um, so that's where I would get into clashes with, people on that, and that's fine. That's one thing that's open for discussion, that they can talk to me about it. And I like I said, some of my colleagues here, I know for a fact would, from having talked to them would not agree with me at all. So I'm probably more, well, definitely, I'm more fundamentalist, as you said, with
Well,
that here at Taylor than in the department than probably anybody. Yeah.
yeah. Well, you'd be more in that middle ground, that saying it's
Yeah.
both, It isn't just morality or moral
Right.
standards that we use to evaluate a film or a poem or whatever, but
Right.
it is important. Barris Gout, what a, it's kind of a strange name, but
I think it changed my name.
yeah, his last name is Gaut, Barris,
Okay.
and is his first name Barris. He's written on this. I think he's at Oxford or Cambridge. He's a British scholar, and he's written some good stuff on this, and that helped me kind of just solidify my categories for thinking about this, because I knew I didn't agree with a Dewey or a Nietzsche, and knew
Mhm.
I didn't agree with the later Tolstoy and contemporary fundamentalists, but moral values need to be considered and are properly applied.
Mhm.
When you have a film that is just, say, brutally gruesome, like these slasher films,
Right.
or one that's pornographic. Okay. It is so substandard morally that, looking at the thing as a work of art, it fails according to Gout, because the moral standard does have aesthetic implications. When you have morally flawed, deeply problematic artworks, from a morally standpoint, that also undermines them aesthetically, he
Yes.
argues.
Right.
And I think that's right.
I'd agree.
And that's why we are tempted to say that pornography is not even art, right?
I
That
I would agree. Yeah.
it might be trying to be art, but it's so problematic morally, that it is so degraded that we don't even want to call it art. I would just call it very, very, very bad art,
That
because
are
it's such a failure on the moral criterion. So you discuss various benefits of creativity. What are some of those?
I this is one of the best things I think about God. Um, he has rules, he has standards, but they always are for our good. It's never a selfish motive on his part. Like, I want you to praise me because I'm, full of myself, or whatever. Praise helps us, helps our attitude. Um, and this turns out to be so in creativity too. People, I don't know anybody who says, "Oh, I hate creativity. Why do I have to be creative?" But if they did, they would still know that there are huge benefits from creativity. So the blessings that God gives us, something like creativity, further blesses us because of all the advantages that it has for us. So it's not just a rule that God has, like, I want you to be creative because I am. I command you to be creative. He knows that it benefits us to be creative. What I was kind of stunning to me was at how many levels, how many different ways. When I was doing my research for Reentering Eden, I found out that being in nature helps you to be more creative. And I thought, huh, interesting. That got me interested. I want to find out more about creativity. So that's what rolled over into this second book. For example, going barefoot in nature, it literally brings ions into your body that, help you be more balanced and have a better attitude and stuff. And the same kind of thing happens with creativity, that it increases, for example, self-esteem. It reduces depression. It helps you feel, less stressed and that kind of thing. And that's why we have, art therapy and that kind of stuff for people with strong mental problems. But it even helps physically, that helps us to think better. It does something to our brain that helps us to make connections better. You were talking earlier about seeing things differently, like through different perspectives, in science, even, to be able to go past paradigms and think, well, what if the world isn't flat? And think beyond what everyone expects to be true. And that is a breakthrough, and so we can make better, synaptic connections in our brain because of that. Or, just literally, it helps us to be healthier. It helps us to resist disease. It boosts our immune system. I don't know how that does that. I don't know at all. But
Mhm.
it's true. It makes people healthier. So from the health level to the mental level to the emotional level, and of course spiritual, I think definitely art can, help you get closer to God. It has with me. I'm sure that in the songs that you've written and stuff like that, you have felt God's presence and you feel closer to God through the things that you've produced. in this book, I have a chapter where I talk about kind of my resistance almost to wanting to do a Christian book, a religious book, because I felt like that was kind of a default. Like that's what a Christian professor does. They write something Christian. For example, when I wrote my book on Dillard, I was talking about her idea of language shaped by her belief system, which she had, and looking at Christ as the Word, and very clear theological implications there. But I didn't want to make it Christian. I didn't want to make it a theological book, so I purposely kind of downplayed that and just kind of worked. I don't know how you could do that, right? How can you downplay the theology when you're talking about Christ as the Word? But I did, and, so the person that picked it up, finally, decided to publish it, did so with the caveat that I bulk up the theology, which to me was this, God slapping me in the face and saying, "Okay, you were not wanting to do that, but I'm telling you that's what you need. You need to be bold." So it was a eye opener to me that it can that creativity should involve all of us, and that you can grow spiritually through that, and you can learn things about yourself and where you're going the wrong direction, and what God wants from you, and how he infuses everything, and don't be afraid to talk about that. And that made a big difference to me, and I think it really impacted the fact that my next two books were explicitly Christian, and I had less problem with it by that, because God had taught me through the process of creating something about my relationship with him.
Well, yeah, let me encourage you in that. You're a good theologian. I mean, we're all theologians. You haven't been formally trained as
No.
others have, but if you well, you're a human being in this world and you're thinking about God, you have beliefs about God, you're doing theology. So we shouldn't be bashful about it, particularly those of us who are trained scholars and are devout Christians. We should be willing to do this now with a certain, with a certain sobriety, as we share our ideas regarding God and the how a Christian worldview should impact what we're doing here or there. Yeah, we should be very careful, but we need to do it all the same. And I think you do it very well. You're both of
Thank you.
those books are very enlightening from a theological standpoint. Um, who would you say are some of your artistic heroes, and, especially writers, but maybe some other creative artists as well?
Well, I when I first thought about that question, I was thinking, who are my favorite writers? Which I think is kind of my heroes, and I see myself modeling somewhat after them. I like some of the things they do, and I want to do a similar thing. So Thoreau, who you mentioned earlier, is one of those who doesn't come across as somebody who's really that innovative or has done anything that unique, and he probably isn't. Um, but he has a beautiful way with language. There's some lines that I can't get out of my head that kind of direct my life, and they're Thoreauvian. And he has an ability to see the spiritual side of nature in a way that few other people can. And so that he's one of them. And a lot of my writing does, like the Reentering Eden, does deal with the spiritual side of nature. Related to that is Andy Dillard, who you also mentioned. I love how she has almost single-handedly reinvented creative nonfiction, with the emphasis on the creative part more than the nonfiction. But how she can take something like almost a book review, a book report of the book she's read, and in-depth talk about that, and then alongside that, talk about scientific details using scientific terminology, and then add the humor and personal experience, and that roundabout way that I talked about earlier, where you think, "What is she saying? What is she doing? She's getting way off track." But then, zoop, she can zip you back into it, and you think, "Ah," make those
Mm.
connections all boom, all of a sudden, just kind of explode in your face. And make sense, and you have to change your idea that, she doesn't know what she's doing, she's scatterbrained, and that all these little pieces come together. A lot of the Impressionists are my favorite artists, Renoir and Monet and so forth. Looking at taking a pond lily or something like that and breaking it into points of light, or diffusing it and making you see it differently, or Van Gogh with his swirls, the air currents that he sees in the sky, things like that. Or in the writing world, I talked about Dillard, but someone who just a beautiful turn of language. Someone like Eudora Welty, who's from your neck of the woods, Catherine Porter, who is loved because she has all these details that work together to E. E. Cummings poetry. Teach that in class, and tell students this poem you cannot even read. It's not readable. You couldn't do a poetry reading and say this poem. It doesn't seem to make any sense. It seems random. It seems like he's just playing with you, but it's so intentional. Every little element of it, works together. How many times he uses a word, how he capitalizes it or doesn't capitalize it. A perfect example is someone who is full of meaning, but doesn't give it to you. I don't like someone like Hawthorne, for example, who says, "Did you catch that I called that character Faith? That's important, and that is significant." Like, yeah, I got that, and it tells you how to interpret it. Like you're too stupid to figure it out. I like the ones that make you work for their meaning,
Mm,
and some kids don't. Some students say, "Oh, come on, just say it." Don't maybe
mm,
look for it. It's not like an Easter egg hunt. But to me, it is. That's what I like about it. So those are my heroes, the ones that have a lot of meaning there for you to find, but you find it.
mhm. I think one of the vices of a lot of evangelical art is that there's kind of this compulsion to spell everything out,
Yeah,
and
or
so
to
the
make the moral really explicit. That kind of thing.
uh-huh.
Yeah.
Whereas I think, yeah, it's prophet Isaiah that refers to God saying, he's talking to God. He says, "Surely you are a God who hides himself."
Hmm.
Might be in Isaiah 45. It's in there that, and we see this theme over and over again that, of course, God's works are marvelously displayed in all of creation, but there's also a subtlety there, um, where we have to do all sorts of interpretive work, whether we're talking about
Hmm.
history. Well, the Bible is a very forbidding collection of texts that, has been frustrating, exasperating, tantalizing minds for centuries. It's hard to understand in many ways. It takes work. And that is true of creation, that God's,
Hmm.
let's say, book of nature. It takes so much scientific expertise to get to well, we're not to the bottom of it, but to get it just as far as we
Get the,
have.
the design. Yeah.
So, yes, kind of emulating God with our own creativity, we should, yeah, make people work for it. It it
Hmm.
it doesn't mean that we should be so elusive and abstruse that, nobody can make any sense of it.
Right.
There is a kind of balance there, but I know what you mean with regard to Dillard. Montaigne is my all-time favorite essayist, maybe my all-time favorite writer.
Mm.
And a recent one is John Updike. I think he's probably more well known for his Rabbit Run
Rabbit
books,
runs. Yeah. Seriously.
but his essays are tremendous. And I'd say he's at least as good as Annie Dillard. Just profoundly insightful, and he can really, in Dillard's like this, really sneak up on you. You think this detour was just sort of kind of a creative display of, some research they've done and here or there on this or that, and then it'll all come home in some
Yeah.
flourish, and it's a profound insight about human nature or something. Updike's the same way as Dillard, so if you haven't read much of
Then
him, check it out.
I've read mostly fiction, not as nonfiction. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. I kind of make that case that that's what Jesus does in his parables in the book that I'm just, finished working on. That, I used to be told that gives these parables that to make us a complex idea very simple and clear. That's what a lot of people think his parables did. But as I get older, I realize just the opposite. He wanted to make them more obscure.
Mm.
Now, what is that? Why would God do that? Why would Jesus want to be difficult to understand? And it's, I think, at the root of what you were just saying, because he needs to have people to look for it. That's how he separates the sheep from the goats. Those that really want to know will pursue him, like his disciples, and said, "Okay, God, Jesus, we didn't understand a bit of that. Explain to us what you meant by that parable." And so he goes through it, and he will explain it point by point. The parable of the sower or whatever. But he needs them to make the effort. He doesn't want it to come just so simply that everybody understands it. He has no way of knowing who are the truly sincere ones unless he makes it a little bit harder for them to understand. They need to seek it.
Yeah, parables, Jesus' parables are fascinating that way. There is a certain level of basic understanding that even a kid can grasp. And then there are layers that, can tantalize you for a lifetime. And there's a riddle quality about
Yeah.
a lot of his teachings, and it did exasperate the disciples. All the
Yep.
figurative language,
Everything figurative. Yeah. They took
even
literally.
yeah,
you know.
the
So
the the the, the Pharisee Nicodemus, was confused by the
yeah,
"you must be born again"
rebirth. Yeah.
metaphor, and we so reference that, and it's so familiar, we forget it's a metaphor,
Right.
and it's not just a metaphor, it's a bizarre metaphor. It really is.
Yeah,
It
it is. Yeah. Can't
it's
climb back into your mother's womb.
yeah,
It's like he takes it so literally.
yeah.
So
And it's easy to look down on him when we probably would have had the same
right.
response,
Yep.
that Jesus was so original with all of his, teachings and so
Yeah.
many of his metaphors. So how does your work as a teacher of college students impact your creative life? Is it a help, a hindrance, or both? And do you gain inspiration for writing ideas from your student?
One pragmatic way is really helpful that I'm a professor because I get sabbaticals. I get, I'm in an organization that wants me to produce things, wants to me to push my creativity and write and that kind of thing. It's not, publish or perish here or anything, but they need to put an emphasis on that. And that spurs me on. But obviously, it takes time away. If I were a full-time writer, I would have more time to write, but I don't know if I have that many ideas that I could fill every day with writing anyway. People say I don't have time, but you probably just don't make the time. You have it, you're just using it on other things. So the last 2 books I wrote were written almost entirely on my free time, from work. I didn't need a sabbatical, in other words, to start them or necessarily even to finish them. It was just a blessing that I had that extra time. So it's good in that way. As far as getting inspiration from my students, not so much, but the books I'm working on most recently, I have gotten a lot of feedback because it's the first one I've written that's kind of a textbook. It's kind of geared that way.
Mm,
It's about Jesus as the word and the implications that it has for writers. So I've been using it in my writing class with freshmen.
mm,
And you have handouts in the appendix and things like that that are more exploring what does that mean for Christ to be the word. And so they've given me really good, excellent feedback on, that wasn't clear to me. That wasn't a great example because that's how I read it and you read it this way. And seeing that there's a big difference between how I, as an old lady, or look at something and how they, as young people, look at that same character, that I'm trying to create, that I think I'm making to say the things that I want them to agree with. And they're like, no, I didn't get that at
mm.
all. So it helps me. I don't resist it or I don't resent it at all. I don't feel like it's working against my creativity. I think it's, it arranged in such a way that it allows me to be more creative. It encourages me to be surrounded by people who value writing the way I do and want to, be writers also. So
That's good.
works well.
I want to conclude with the question that I always ask our guests, and that is, what do you conceive to be the ultimate meaning of life? And how is your work a manifestation of your view on the purpose of life? So there you go. There's a big one.
Oh, gee, that's such a small little question. I don't know why you asked that.
So
I, I,
trivial.
I do not even pretend to know the secret of life. But to me, I mean, you can always resort to the catechism to love God and enjoy Him forever. And I do think there's real truth in that. I try to make everything I do be honoring to God, because He is the number one factor in my life. And so, whether it's my parenting, my grandparenting, what I say in my books, what I tell my students, how I teach, all of that, I try to, wrap around the principles of, what's God's best for our lives? What does He want from us? How can I convey that to other people? How can I share the good news of Christ? And, thing where you're talking about what inspires God's creativity. I'm thinking, especially if I had His missions, to know that it was going to be a colossal failure, that creating people was really a dumb move. Why didn't you do that? Because like 90% of us are going to go away from you. Why didn't you do that? You knew that, but yet somehow it was worth it for the risk. I don't know. I have no way of explaining that. If I figure that I can't understand God's reason for making us, then I can't understand our reason for being here,
Yeah.
except to think it's to honor God, to give purpose to His original plan, to have fellowship with Him. So,
Good. Yeah. A lot of mystery there for sure.
oh
And
yeah,
and that's precisely one of the things that prompts us to create, right? To kind of
yeah.
explore these mysteries. Well, I've really appreciated this time with you. Thank you so much,
Thank
Colleen.
you. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the Kalos Center podcast. We gave you our thoughts. Now let us know what you think. Email us at podcast@kalos.center.